Okay, great. Good morning, everyone. So, welcome. If this is, I don't know if this is, well, let me rephrase that. If this is someone's first webinar, what I'll do is just introduce myself and legalese before we jump into the topic, as well as Lauren, who's also going to be presenting. So, my name is Eitan. I'm the director of legalese. My background is I'm a commercial lawyer, and we've been working for almost 9 years on legalese, offering legal guidance to startups, creative businesses, nonprofits, social enterprises of all sorts, and we offer a range of different legal guidance from commercial work to regulatory work to labor to intellectual property and protection. So that's me. Joining me today from our team is Lauren. Lauren, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Lauren. As it says, I'm a data commercial lawyer here at Legalese, and I head up the data and regulations department at Legalese as well.
Okay, great. And maybe just a little bit more about legalese. We can go to the next slide there, Lauren. Lauren's going to be controlling the slideshows. We're in two different locations. Yeah, just legalese is very company culture focused company, and all of as our clients are kind of interesting and innovative organizations. So are our lawyers. So all really experienced from big practices, from other legal backgrounds, and all kind of focused on making sure we offer top legal advice to startups, nonprofits, tech, and creative companies. Cool. So maybe just on a little bit today to the topic. What we're here to talk about today is nonprofits and social enterprises. So we're going to dig a little bit into what they are and how they work. But in short, what is a nonprofit or a social enterprise? And it's a bit hard to find a definition which encompasses all, but I think these are businesses with specific either activist or philanthropic or charitable or purpose-driven aims, right? So they're businesses that are trying to contribute something to the world outside of just making money, right? Which we'll get into why that's an important difference. And we're not here to talk about, what work you should do or why organizations should be purpose-driven. We're here to talk about the company structures which give effectiveness. So, and why is legal guidance important here? Well, if you get your company structuring right, then there's really big advantages which you can take which you can take advantage of when you're putting together your organization, right? And I mean, as that famous saying goes, with great power comes great responsibilities. So if you are going to register a non-profit company, which is a structure which you can do, you're not going to have to pay tax on that, well, income tax, but there's some big compliance and admin that you have to do on the back end. So, and essentially what I'm getting at is the laws that are there around running nonprofits are very specific, and they're really important to the success of that organization. So we're going to talk about nonprofits, some of the aspects of compliance there. And we're also going to talk about this thing called social enterprises, which isn't a specific term in South African law, but it's a specific term in South Africa's business landscape. We're going to talk about what social enterprises are and what you would have to do in order to run one of these to set them up. So we're going to cover four areas here. We're going to cover, firstly, compliance around running a nonprofit or social enterprise. We're going to cover fundraising and your different ideas around structuring fundraising, which is really important. We're then going to cover hybrid structures or these social enterprises. And lastly, we'll dig a little bit into employees and employee regulations around nonprofits. So that's what we have to look forward to. We're probably not going to use the full hour. So I imagine we'll probably use about half an hour of this. And then what we can do is open up for some questions at the end. At any time, if you want, just throw a question into that little question bar, put a comment, put a question. We'll make sure we answer it. If we don't tackle it at that moment, we'll tackle it at the end. So please just keep the questions coming. We're here today to hopefully enlighten you guys about this. What's our experience in this area of law? Well, from a personal perspective, this nonprofits and all the nonprofit sector is actually where my career started. Before I ran legalese, ran a tech company with hybrid structure of a tech company and a nonprofit organization called liable and concerned consumers, all around conscious consumerism and shopping and eating practices, like free range meat practices and recycling and that sort of industry. So that's where my career started. Personally, with legalese over the years, we've done lots of work for lots of different organizations some big global ones like Change.org, Global Citizen, some local nonprofits that do amazing work like Green Pop, and some, kind of, some other African-centric organizations or kind of organizations that exist around Africa, such as Phoenix, that do educational funding. They're a tech platform that has a social aim as well as a business aim to it. So that is us. That's a little bit about us. What I'm going to do is I'm going to hand over to Lauren to kick off the next section, and you'll hear from me again in a few minutes. So please keep the questions coming, and yeah, it's hopefully we have a really productive session. Lauren.
So, thank you, Ethan. Okay, we're going to start off chatting about compliance and just understanding your compliance and little aspects about compliance, especially for non-profit organizations as a whole, and not necessarily only NPCs. To kick this off, we're going to chat a bit about and just small description about the different types of entities that kind of form part of this ecosystem of nonprofit organizations. The first being a nonprofit company. This is generally the most common of them, and a nonprofit company is a company that is registered in terms of the Companies Act, whose sole purpose is not the generation of profit, but the furtherance of a public benefit activity. So although you're a company registered under the Companies Act, your aim is not to sell things to create profit, to create more money. The aim is to do activities that have a public benefit focus or philanthropic focus. Next is a legal trust. So a legal trust is an entity that has been set up by a trust founder, in terms of which property is transferred and administered by trustees on behalf of beneficiaries. Most of us are very familiar with trusts. Trusts are regulated in accordance with a deed of trust, that is its founding document, and they are regulated by the Trust Property Control Act as well as the Master of the High Court. This is an important thing to understand, is that trusts are not self-regulating. The master has oversight function, and there's lots of other administrative nuances with trusts as well. Next is a voluntary association. A voluntary association is, as the name says, created when a group of 3 or more people come into agreement to form an organization with a common purpose. This purpose doesn't necessarily have to be philanthropic or with public benefit, but it's usually a non-profit objective. A more common example of these are typically like recreational sports clubs, are normally formed, sports associations for a specific type, and overseeing bodies. In most instances, these are actually voluntary associations. So if you hear something is the X association governing some sort of industry, in most cases, that may be a voluntary association. Next is a non-profit organization. This is not to be confused with the acronym NPC, which stands for nonprofit company. A nonprofit organization is any entity that has been registered as such with the Department of Social Development. An NPO can include a trust or a NPC or a VA. It's just that it's then registered with the Department of Social Development. The pros of registering with the department is that these entities are then included in the department's database of NPOs. They also then receive a certificate, and typically registering as an NPO also opens you up for opportunities for investment and grant funding, especially from the government. Then lastly is public benefit organizations. Similar with NPOs, a public benefit organization can be any of the entities which we have listed before. It is a public benefit organization is an entity that has been given the status by SARS. It means that they're able to obtain approval to issue tax-deductible donations to donors. This is what people commonly know as Section 18A approval. It means that when you receive donations, you can then provide tax certificates for that. And as I said, a public benefit organization can either be an NPC or a trust or a voluntary association. There's no limit on that. It just simply, the title just simply means that it's been registered with SARS. Cool. Moving on to compliance, the first aspect we want to chat about is tax compliance. No matter what entity you choose or format you take, you must ensure that your organization is tax compliant. This is extremely important. Tax compliance at the bare minimum means ensuring that you at least have an accountant who reviews or assists you to manage your financial affairs and your compliance requirements. Tax compliance is especially important if you're looking to move into the sphere of becoming a public benefit organization, or if you are a public benefit organization, it's very important to maintain your tax compliance because SARS requires that in order to keep your status. Next is data compliance. Many of your entities might think that you necessarily don't need to be compliant in these sections, but regardless of your form, if you're carrying on any source of business, you need to be compliant with POPI, first of all, which is the Protection of Personal Information Act. We all process personal information. There's no grounds to say that you do not. If you take in someone's name, their email, their number, you're required to be POPI compliant, especially if you're running an entity. POPI compliance is a bit more of I won't say complicated, but there are internal and external elements that compose it. Again, you can come chat to us if you want to know more about that, but it's something that your organization needs to take on. One lesser known compliance element in the data sphere is PIA, which is the Promotion of Access to Information Act. This act was made to give effect to the right to access to information, so access in terms of public bodies, and then access to private bodies' information, but only where you need to protect a right. PIA compliance is not as in-depth as POPI compliance. It simply requires that your entity publishes a PIA manual. These are not hard to do. You can chat to us if you need some guidance. They're very simple and simply require you to post them on your website. And if you don't have a website, just have a copy printed in your box. Next is the Companies Act. This we thought was very important to note is that NPCs are still ultimately companies, and they are regulated and registered in terms of the Companies Act, the same as any other company. What this means is that NPCs have a requirement to ensure they abide by all the compliance elements of the Companies Act. This includes keeping records for a minimum of 5 years, for example, having directors' meetings recorded and decisions recorded, and also keeping your information updated with the CIPC. So that means when a director leaves, you need to note that. When you bring on new directors, you need to note that. If you change your address, for example, all these elements need to be recorded to ensure that you stay up to date with your compliance. Cool. I see there's a question. Thank you for your question, Samuel. You're asking, NPO which is not registered as an NPC, how can it be registered for tax? Okay, I think let's answer that maybe towards the end, and we can touch on your question with regards to that element of tax compliance. Next. So the next section we're going to chat about is investments into social enterprises or nonprofit entities. We're just going to touch a bit on types of investments and things to consider when taking on funding or investment. There we go. So, important factors when considering investment. Firstly, is this funding right for you? The first step into taking funding, and I understand as a nonprofit entity, all fundings is normally welcomed and valued, and it may be difficult to sit back and think, really, is there a question on whether we should or should not take this? But it is important to consider if the funding you're applying for is right for you and the purpose of your entity. For example, if your entity has more, if your entity has a certain focus, certain funding may not be appropriate for you. Secondly, another important factor is aligning the objective of your entity with that of the entity that's providing your funding. So an example of this is, I don't know if anyone watches Formula One, but one of the Formula One teams, for example, received a sponsorship from funding. However, the donor then, it was found that the donor source of funds was Russian-based, and unfortunately, that didn't align with the aim of the team, the values, the aim of the company. And unfortunately, they had to let that funding go. So as an NPC, even though it might seem as though you need funding and the funding will help further your purpose, it's important to consider also the source of the funding and whether that aligns with your company, your goals, your values, even your other donors, considering what their values are, their purposes and aims, and as well as the entities or persons or environments or animals that you're looking to protect and help. Next is contracting. So once you've approved your funding, you've accepted it, you're ready to go. A very, very important step is making sure that there's a contract in place to regulate the relationship between you and the funder or the donor. A contract is very important as it ensures a certainty between you and the donor as to aspects such as repayments in the case of where it's a loan. Consequences of default, especially, are important because you want to ensure that your entity is always protected. For example, certain donors may require more oversight than others, and these are aspects that are important to look at in the agreement that you're either provided with or that you and the funder then set up. For example, certain donors may seek to own the intellectual property that you create using the funding that they provide. These are factors that you need to consider. Are you willing to give up that control and that ownership in relation to the funding? These are all aspects that are regulated by a contract, and it's very, very important to make sure that one, you have one in place, two, you know what it says, three, you're happy with the contents of, and it adequately protects you as well as the donor. Next is accountability. When you're taking on funding, you need to ensure that you're financially accountable. You must be set up to use the funding you receive for the purpose for which it was provided and the aims that you've set out in your constitutional document. So if you've set out an aim to protect animals and to further the protection of animals, but you're using your funding for an entirely different purpose, that's not being accountable to your funder and to your entity. Being financially accountable may include things like setting up a budget or financial reporting. This could be quarterly, could be financial year, but it's just important to make sure that you have a set plan on how to use your funding and you're accountable. And then lastly for my section is the difference between loans and grants. Loan funding is funding that is lent to you with the promise of repayment within a specified period of time. Grant funding, on the other hand, is typically a donation, and these may be awarded by government departments, trusts, big corporations. Grant funding, although it may be a donation and there's not necessarily a requirement for repayment, they may carry certain target obligations that you as a recipient may need to meet in order for the funding to continue or for the funding not to be taken away. As I said, loan funding is normally the vehicle, but grant funding is also a very popular source for increases.
Okay, great. Thanks, Lauren. I think maybe what I'll do quickly is just answer Samuel's question. Samuel, I think what you're asking is how can you be registered for tax? So, your NPO status, that is your statement that's given by the Department of Social Development. Your non-profit company, which we'll dig into a second, is your actual company structure. So your tax registration is going to be for your non-profit company. Your tax registration is going to be for whatever company structure you choose. So if you're a non-profit organization, it's registered as a private company, as an example, then you'd need to register that for tax. Or if it was a trust, then you need to register that for tax. So it really just depends. I'm not fully sure I understand your question, but what I think your question is very just depends on the type of organization. Okay, great. So what I want to talk about now are hybrid structures. So before, you can go to the next slide. So before we understand what a hybrid structure is, we need to understand what a business structure is. Okay, and a business structure, if you think, the analogy I like to think of it as is your business structure is your land on which your house is built on. So if your business is your house, the business structure is the land, right? And every business, like every house, needs a structure in which to sit on. So every business is going to have a structure. Some are going to be more complex than others, and it's not a one-size-fits-all sort of thing, right? And so what we do when we look at company structuring is we try and match the business, their needs, their factors to that specific business, to the different options that you have for company structuring. So if you think about two different businesses, let's say Google, global business, different interests in different countries, needs specific tax compliance or tax efficiency is going to be very different to, say, Legalese, which predominantly is an African company and focuses on the South African market predominantly. So that is, it's not a one-size-fits-all. And we often get people coming to us and saying, look, I know a business that use this structure, can we implement that? And I always want to take one step deeper and look at it to make sure it suits them. So the main types of structures we get in South Africa is firstly Pty Ltd. These are private companies. This is what we know as everyday companies in South Africa. You also get CCs. Now, CCs are in the process of being phased out. You can't register new ones, but you still find them around. I wouldn't waste too much time talking about them now. Sole proprietorships, that's when you yourself just starts a business. Partnership, which is a partnership of more than one sole proprietor. Public companies, LTDs, and non-profit companies. Now, like what Lauren said, according to the Companies Act, non-profit companies and private companies are actually the same type of company. They're operated by the Companies Act. There are just some slight differences. So the thing which I just want everyone to understand before we go into social enterprise and hybrid structures is these are your main types of company structures in South Africa. So then the question is, for what type of company is going to suit you? Lauren, you can go to the next slide. So if you are a profit-driven, so if you are a profit-driven company, so you want to earn profit, you want to own what you build, and you're looking to kind of make money, then a for-profit company is a really good structure, right? If you are, you can go to the next slide. If your business is less about making money and more about doing good for the world, well, then you've got this non-profit structure that you could use, right? A non-profit structure is you can't own your work, right? You've got less control because you've got this board of directors that have to be appointed. So you have to have 3 directors, but the massive advantage you get is you are not charged any tax. So often people, so if you have a business, you're choosing your structure, and now you're trying to make the decision between this non-profit or profit. But now the problem comes up in that it's actually not such a good distinction anymore, right? Because there are a lot of businesses today that do good work and contribute to the world, but also want to make a profit. In my mind, that's the ideal business. So what you've got is you've got this structure, which we call a hybrid structure, but it's actually an idea of meshing together a non-profit company and a profit company to try and get the most out of those 2 structures. I'll go through an example in a minute because I know it's confusing, but in short, what it would look like is that you have a profit company in part of your structure, which can own what you build and can make a profit. And then you've got a non-profit structure, which doesn't pay tax and can do this really, really amazing thing of attract donations, right? Because why do people give donations to non-profit companies? Well, because they understand that non-profit companies are going to have accountability because they've got the board of director. They can't turn a profit, so no one's going to be drawing that money out of it. And essentially, they're going to do work for the good of the public. So what we do is we would try to create a structure that meshes those 2 together. I don't know if that is clear enough. So what I think, I'll go through an example in a second, but essentially, like, it would be ideal in South African law if there was a 3rd type of company called a social enterprise. That's a company that does good work and has a social cause and also wants to make a profit, but it doesn't exist. Other countries have it, but it doesn't exist in South Africa. So what we try to do when we're thinking about hybrid structures is we're trying to mesh these 2 together. Why doesn't everyone do this? Why doesn't everyone just say, well, let me start a non-profit company and a profit company, let me attract donations, let me own what I create? You can't, because there's certain responsibilities that you would have, right? There's regulatory boundaries. Each structure has certain things that it's allowed to do. So you're not allowed to do whatever you want with non-profit companies. There's also big accountabilities. Once you have a non-profit company, you are accountable to your donors, to SIPSI, to SARS. There's accountabilities that you need to know about. And essentially, through everything around hybrid structures, you've got this one really big rule, is that no money can cross the line. No money that's given to your non-profit company as a donation can cross the line and move to your profit company as profit or additional value. So that's really the big rule in all of this. I know that this is confusing because it's a confusing area of law, but maybe if I use an example, I'll be able to articulate it. So let's say you've got a tech company that creates, a really good example might be an educational platform, right? So you've got a tech company that has created an educational platform. Now this educational platform does good because it will be used to educate people and people that don't have access to schools or universities, but it may also, but also the tech that's been created is quite valuable. So what you might want to do is you could say, cool, we'll own the tech through a profit company, and we'll deploy the tech to the schools and to the learners through a non-profit company, right? Then you might have a license agreement of sort connecting the 2. So maybe every student that goes through the non-profit company, which is deploying the tech, a license fee is paid over to the profit company. And that could be a really advantageous license fee. Let's say if market rate is 100 Rand, you could say, cool, we'll sell it over, we'll license it at 20 Rand or 50 Rand, something really affordable. So that this non-profit company is, while it is paying money to the profit company to use the technology, it's paying a really, really good fee. So that can be defended. Something else, so the nonprofit company is never losing out. It's never paid. It's contracting donations to deploy the technology, and it's paying this license fee over to the profit company. To make it even more defensible, you could say, cool, the nonprofit company even owns a slice of the profit company. So over years, the system is built up, and now suddenly this technology is worth a lot. If it is ever sold, the nonprofit company gets a share of that. So I guess what I'm trying to articulate through an example is to say, like, what we could do is we could utilize these two structures to make a really advantageous group structure, which is a hybrid between the two. And it means that the nonprofit never loses out and the profit company is able to gain value. Hope that makes sense. I know it's confusing. I see there's a question there. Oh, it's the same question as earlier. Cool. So that's the point that I have around hybrid structures. Again, it is really hard to kind of give an example of a hybrid structure or create an example which is relevant for everyone. So I can picture people at home sitting there thinking, oh, I don't quite see it. It's hard to give a kind of general example about these things. So, if you have a structured company and you're looking to create a hybrid structure, so utilizing the best of profits and profits, come chat to us. We can use your company as a live example and try and design a structure. Company structuring, I put a post on LinkedIn the other day about company structuring as an art. It's like a puzzle. You put these pieces together in the correct way to kind of make sense of it. And what we do, and we do that for purpose-driven businesses, is we're often looking at how we get the most out of the profit structure and the non-profit structure. So that's on that. The next thing I want to just touch on quite briefly is employee relationships. So this is relevant for all companies, not just nonprofits, but we often see these issues pop up with nonprofits. So I think it's a really good opportunity. If there's anyone here that runs a nonprofit or a social enterprise, let's recap these things. The first thing that you need to understand is that there are differences between contractors and employees, right? Employees are full-time, they're controlled by the company pays tax on their behalf, whereas independent contractors are not full-time. They control their own working hours, they own their own tools of the trade, they contract to the company as and when the company needs. How do you know the difference? It's quite unclear, actually. There's subtle differences between the two, and there's even one court judgment which says if it looks like when they're trying to establish what employment is, they say if it looks like employment and smells like employment, then it's employment. But it's not I don't know if that's more misleading or not, but essentially the law follows what we call the dominant impression test. So if you're trying to decide if your staff are employees or independent contractors, you look at all the factors relating to them, where they work from, their hours of work, where they're paid, does the company pay tax on their behalf, all the factors, and you decide, the court would decide if those are employees or contractors, but it's not always clear. Bottom line for anyone here is that if you have a staff contingent, it's really, if you just go back online, it's really important if you've got a staff contingent that you understand what your staff contingent is. Are they contractors or are they employees? It's really important. And sometimes there's an idea that nonprofits are exempt from the employee regulations. They're certainly not in the slightest. So it's really important to know the difference. And the next thing I want to talk about is probably the most helpful piece of advice I can give you for anything law, but specifically around employees, is that it's really important to have the correct contracts in place, right? If you've got employees, they need to have proper employment contracts. If you've got independent contractors, volunteers, interns, whatever it is, you need to have a contract in place. We hear people say, oh, I've just got interns, they don't have contracts. That's really dangerous. You're giving your intern, first of all, you're giving your interns access to your work, to your intellectual property, but also those interns, if they don't understand the relationship that they have with the organization, they might assume they're employees. Then you can land up in some really big trouble. So it's really, really important to have contracts in place, and 95% of your legal issues that could come up, probably 90% of your legal issues that could come up could really just be answered by what does the contract say. So put the terms of employment or your contractors into contracts. I can't stress it enough. The other thing I want to talk about is company policies. So company policies are super important, right? Because these kind of give a little bit more color to your working place policies. So you got your employment contract, which covers the big stuff, the how much they're paid, what are their roles and responsibilities, confidentiality, termination, etc. But there's lots more things that kind of come up with a business and come up in the day-to-day. And the more mature a business is, the more policies they essentially need to have, because they need to communicate to their staff how things work there. These will be things like your leave policy, how they apply for leave, how much leave they're given. Today, really important is your remote work policy. Not all staff are required to work from the office, or some have a hybrid. But if you don't have that down in place, there's going to be confusion around it. And I think one of the things that we see nonprofits suffer from a lot is that there is kind of a lack of clarity for their staff around, because when people work for a nonprofit, they commit to this greater aim. There's a great sense of camaraderie. And sometimes people forget that labor laws are really important and still apply. So having these policies in place, such as remote work policy, is a great idea. Bonus policy, people are not working for nonprofits out of the good of their heart. A lot of these organizations are exceptionally well funded and need to attract really good talent, right? And good talent need to be rewarded fairly. So if you've got a bonus structure about how people earn extra, it needs to be there. Also, sexual harassment policy, really important today. Often when you're working in environments where there's murky territory around management levels, or around people around each other and become friends in the office, it's important to have a policy in place about what your company's view is towards sexual harassment, so people understand what sexual harassment is in the workplace. So and as even with companies that are working online, kind of put in place what's the correct way to deal with each other online, to make sure that no one's ever stepping over a line. And I think that's really important, that all companies should have in place. Also, dress policy. Important as your organization grows. It's something that you want your staff to be wearing, or to wear on specific occasions, such as how do they dress when they come to an office, how do they dress when they go see client or partners, or how do they dress when they go to the events. There might be a bunch of other additional work policies that we haven't discussed here, and so this is really just going to be up to your business to work out. What's important for you, what's important for your staff. For us, one of the things that's really important in our business is communication policy. We've got very important rules around that. People being accessible during the day, whether on Slack or email. That's important for us because we're remote and we know we deal with clients. We need to act fast. So communication policy is important for us. It might not be for you. Point is, if you're running an organization, you need to kind of think that one through. And then the last thing here is directors' contracts. So this is often forgotten for nonprofits, but I think it's really important, is that your directors, even though they might be the founders of the organization, they are employees, they do owe a duty to the organization. They can be hired and they can be fired. And that's super, super important, especially if you're trying to attract funding to your organization, to make sure that the directors are accountable on contracts, and that if they are misusing, if they're not working within the same aim of the organization, that they can be fired. So then back to what Lauren spoke about a minute ago, it's really important for nonprofits to have a constitution, a guiding principle where this organization is going. And that's the sort of accountability structure. You've got your guiding principle where it's going. You've got your board of directors who are there to steer it in the right direction. You've got your members who are part of it, and then your beneficiaries who are supposed to get the benefit from this organization. If your directors are steering in the wrong direction, they need to be fired, but they can only be fired for something like this if there is a contract in place. I think that's really important. The last thing is an advisory board. Your board of directors, maybe your nonprofit needs 3 directors on the board, right? Can have more, can't have less. And that's to ensure accountability. Those people can't be married, they can't be brother and sister, they can't be part of the same family, right? So to ensure that there's accountability, me and my wife can't start a nonprofit organization together because there's a chance we might collude with each other and try to steer in a specific direction. So it needs to have that accountability. Why? Because you're going to be raising funds and getting donations. And if you're taking other people's money and not paying tax, it's really important for you to be accountable. But outside of your 3 board members, lots of people say, cool, then let's have 20 board members and they can all give opinions. The problem with that is that it's a nightmare to run your organization then, because having 20 people vote, having 20 people partake in discussions, be a nightmare. So what you can do is put in place an advisory board, right? You have your 3 board members who run the organization. You've got an advisory board, and your advisory board's job is to give that additional input and advise in specific areas. If your organization is in the education space, or let's say it's in the animal welfare space, you might have a vet on your advisory board. You might have an animal rights activist on your advisory board. You might have a lawyer on your advisory board, right? You don't need those people involved in the day-to-day, but when something relates to their specific area, you can draw down to them for information. I think the advisory board is a really important thing to think about. It's non-employed position, still use a contract in place for them, but it's important to think about. So that's about it. That's all, folks. So yeah, I think we've got a few more minutes. If there are any questions, you're welcome to just put them in the question thing. Today, what we've tried to do is give a bit of a high-level overview around non-profit organizations, their compliance, raising money, employment, and then also we touched on hybrids, so social enterprises. Thank you. Thanks to everyone for joining. We've got a few more minutes. I mean, we've got plenty of time. So if there are questions, we're just going to wait another few minutes to see if anyone's got a question. If not, and you want to review this presentation, and we're going to be putting it on our YouTube channel. There's all the other webinars are there on the YouTube channel. So just Google Legalese on YouTube and you'll find it. We'll also put it on our socials and Facebook and Instagram and LinkedIn, so you can grab it there, share it with anyone you want. And just so everyone knows, we do these webinars once a month. Always try to pick an interesting topic and deal with it. Have a lawyer from our team deal with it. So if you've got any topic suggestions and that you want to chat about or you want us to chat about, please do let us know. Okay, another minute for last questions, otherwise we're going to call it. I think that is, let's see the chats. Great. Hopefully that either means it was clear or it was shy. Okay, Alistair, thanks. What about liabilities of the board members? That's really interesting. So your board members, remember, not your advisory board, your board of directors owes, just like with private companies, you owe certain fiduciary duties to the company. That's, you are the working person, the person that's the human representative of this juristic person. So your liabilities are going to be the liabilities that are found in the Companies Act. So if you run this organization while it's insolvent, if you commit fraud on behalf of the organization, you could be liable. If the organization hits some bad times, bad financial times, loses its funding and goes broke or isn't able to pay its bills, there's where the corporate veil is. So you're not going to be held liable for that, just like you wouldn't be held liable for it in a private company. But if you've committed fraud or ran the company under insolvent circumstances, you would. So it's the exact same as the private companies, and you can find all those exact liabilities in the Companies Act. They're called the fiduciary duties. You've got the duty to act in the best interest of the organization. If you don't, then you can be in trouble. But if you do and something goes wrong, that's the nature of the company. Thanks for the question, Alistair. Okay, cool. I think that's about it. Great. Okay, cool, guys. Thanks everyone for joining. People are starting to stream out, so I think we're going to call it there. If you need anything, get in touch with us. We're here to answer any of the questions. We do a lot of work with nonprofit organizations and social enterprises. Thank you, Lauren. Appreciate you joining.
Thank you.
See you all next time.